Picture this. Three towers taller than an 8-story building standing in an open field. From a distance they look like something out of a fantasy film, thick dark trunks rising 50, 60, 80 feet into the air, crowned with wide lace-like discs that catch the light like halos. Get closer and you realize the trunks aren't wood or stone, they're fruit. Thousands of pieces of it stacked and threaded and wired together in a solid column from the ground almost to the clouds. Grapes, apples, pears, squash. Gourds hanging in cascades like something too heavy for gravity to be allowed to hold up. And the strangest part isn't even the size. It's that nobody in the photo seems to think this is strange. There are men in top hats standing at the base pointing casually upward like they're admiring a new street lamp. Nobody's panicking. Nobody's worshiping it. It's just there. 100-year-old photograph of something that looks like it belongs in a myth, treated like Tuesday. That's the image that's been floating around the internet for the past year or two, usually stamped with a big bold word across the bottom. Erased. Forbidden. Stolen. You've probably seen a version of it, the claim that these towers are proof of a lost global civilization, a network of ancient food forests that fed entire cities without anyone owning them, until 13 secret families supposedly carved the whole thing up and buried the truth. It's a good story. It's the kind of story that's built to spread mystery, conspiracy, a villain with no face. They don't want you to know this hook that does half the work for you. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't work, because clearly it does. That's why you're seeing this photo everywhere. But I did something a lot of people don't bother doing with a photo like this. I went and found out what it actually is. Not what a caption says it is. What it is, where it was taken, who built it, why, and what happened to it. And what I found is stranger and honestly better than the conspiracy. Because the real story isn't about something being hidden from you. It's about something that's been standing in the same spot in public for over 200 years, and almost nobody bothered to ask. So let's ask. The towers in that photo are in Stuttgart, Germany, specifically on a stretch of open ground on the banks of the Neckar River called the Cannstatter Wasen, and they have an actual name. They're called Fruchtsäulen, fruit columns, not food forests, not remnants of a vanished empire. Fruit columns, built on purpose by a specific person for a specific festival, and the paperwork for all of it still exists. To understand why anyone would build a 50-foot tower out of fruit in the first place, you have to go back to 1815, to a volcano on the other side of the planet that most people have never heard of, Mount Tambora, in what's now Indonesia. It's the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. It threw so much ash and sulfur into the upper atmosphere that it changed the color of sunsets in London and dropped global temperatures enough to trigger what's now called the year without a summer. In 1816, snow fell in New England in June. Crops failed across Europe and North America. In the small German kingdom of Württemberg, the harvest collapsed 2 years running, and people starved. The king of Württemberg at the time was a man named Wilhelm I. He'd just taken the throne in the middle of this crisis, and instead of just riding it out, he and his wife, Queen Katharina, decided to attack the actual problem, agriculture. In 1817, they founded what was essentially a state agricultural bureau, aimed at modernizing farming, introducing better livestock breeding, and giving farmers a reason to believe things could get better. And in September of 1818, to launch the whole thing, they threw a festival on that open field by the river. Horse races, livestock competitions, farming exhibitions, a parade. It was, in effect, one of the first state fairs in European history, and it was designed from day one to be a public symbol of recovery, a way of saying out loud in front of tens of thousands of people, "The famine is over, we are going to rebuild, and abundance is coming back." That festival needed a centerpiece, something you could see from across the field, something that would communicate abundance without a single word. The king's court architect, a man named Nikolaus Friedrich von Thouret, designed it, a towering wooden column, built up and wrapped entirely in the literal produce of the harvest, fruit, vegetables, grain, topped with an ornamental crown. It stood at the center of the very first festival in 1818, and it's been the symbol of that festival, in one form or another, ever since. That festival is still running today. You may have heard of it under a different name, the Cannstatter Volksfest, sometimes called the Stuttgart Beer Festival, now one of the largest folk festivals in the world, pulling in around 4 million visitors a year. Every single one of those visitors walks past a fruit column because it's rebuilt for the festival to this day. The photographs in that viral thumbnail aren't relics of a lost world. They're historical photographs, probably early 20th century, based on the style of the exact same festival tradition that's still happening in Stuttgart right now, this year, this September. So the towers aren't mysterious. They're not unexplained. There's an architect's name attached to the design. There's a founding date. There's a reason, a very human, very specific, very documented reason that has nothing to do with a hidden civilization and everything to do with a king trying to convince a starving population that the crops would grow again. Now, here's where it actually gets interesting, because the fruit column doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not a one-off invention. It's part of a much older European tradition of building enormous, elaborate monuments entirely out of food. And that tradition goes back centuries before Stuttgart, and it comes with its own genuinely wild history. In Naples in the 1600s, there was a festival tradition called the Cuccagna. The word comes from Caccani, a old European folk myth of a mythical land of plenty, a place where rivers ran with wine, roofs were made of pastry, and food fell from the sky without anyone having to work for it. It was a peasant fantasy of abundance, the medieval equivalent of a no-scarcity dream, and it shows up in folk stories across the continent for hundreds of years. To celebrate that myth, and to celebrate their own rulers, Neapolitan nobles began building actual physical monuments soaked in food. In June of 1629, for the feast of St. John the Baptist, the city built a triumphal arch in honor of the Spanish viceroy, completely covered in cured hams, wheels of cheese, stacked loaves of bread, and whole roasted pigs. Some rigged with tubes so fireworks could shoot out of their mouths. Once the ceremony was done, the crowd was let loose on it, and the public tore the entire structure apart with their hands to eat it. That wasn't a one-time stunt. Cuccagna festivals like this were staged again and again through the 1600s and 1700s, funded by local nobility, partly as genuine celebration and partly. Historians are pretty blunt about this, as a way for the ruling class to put on a show of generosity for a population that was, most of the time, genuinely poor and hungry. Out of that same tradition came something a little more democratic and a lot more physically ridiculous: the Albero della Cuccagna, the Tree of Plenty. Instead of a monument the crowd tore apart at the end, this was a single tall pole, greased with lard or soap, with prizes, hams, cheeses, sometimes actual cash tied to the very top. Whoever could climb it, slipping and sliding the whole way while the crowd watched and laughed, got to keep whatever they reached. This tradition spread to villages across Italy, and it never really died. It's still practiced today in towns like Gubbio in central Italy, where a grease pole cuccagna is part of the local festival calendar every November. It even crossed the Atlantic. Every May in Philadelphia, at the South 9th Street Italian Market Festival, they still put up a greased pole with provolone and cash tied to the top, and teams build human pyramids trying to reach it, the exact same way their great-grandparents did it in Naples 150 years ago. So what you're actually looking at when you look at that thumbnail is one branch of a much bigger, much older European custom of building monuments out of food to mark hard times, harvests, and hope. Germany had its fruit columns. Italy had its cuccagna trees and edible arches. Different countries, different centuries, same basic human instinct. When things have been scarce, you build something enormous and generous out of food, and you let people look at it, or in Naples's case, eat it, as proof that scarcity isn't permanent. None of that requires a lost civilization. It requires people who lived through famine and wanted, very badly, to celebrate the idea that abundance was possible again. And the Naples arches weren't a modest affair, either. It's worth actually picturing what they looked like up close, because the scale of it is almost as striking as the fruit columns themselves. The 1629 arch built for the Spanish viceroy wasn't just draped in a few decorative garlands. It was stacked floor to roofline with entire wheels of cheese, whole-cured ham hocks, loaves of bread built into the architecture itself, salami hung like garlands, and specialty pear-shaped cheeses from the region called Caciocavallo, all engineered onto a wooden canvas frame built specifically for the occasion. 2 live pigs were positioned with tubes fitted into their mouths, so fireworks could be set off through them as part of the spectacle. It was designed to be consumed, quite literally. At a certain point in the celebration, the crowd was let loose on the structure and allowed to tear it apart with their bare hands and carry the food home. Historians studying these festivals have been candid about what was really going on underneath the celebration. These events were staged, in large part, by a ruling class that governed a genuinely poor and hungry population, and putting on this kind of spectacle was as much about visibly performing generosity and control as it was about pure celebration. That's a real, documented, sometimes uncomfortable piece of history, a lot more textured than Food Forest, and a lot more honest about power and hunger than a conspiracy video that skips straight to secret families. Here's the part of this story that I think is genuinely the most interesting, and it's also the part that, if I'm honest, a conspiracy channel would have twisted into proof of something sinister. Because the fruit column actually was taken down once, deliberately, on purpose, for decades. After the First World War, when the German monarchy collapsed and the Weimar Republic was formed, the fruit column was pulled from the Cannstatter Festival. Why? Because it was seen, correctly, as a symbol of the monarchy. Wilhelm I had commissioned it. It had stood for a royal house that no longer existed in a country that had just abolished its kings. In a newly republican Germany, a giant column built to celebrate a king's agricultural reforms was, politically, exactly the kind of imagery the new government didn't want front and center at a public festival. So it disappeared from the Waisen. If you stop the story right there, you'd have everything a hidden history video needs. A beloved public monument, quietly removed, its symbolism politically inconvenient. That's a true fact, and on its own it sounds like the beginning of a cover-up. But it isn't one because we know exactly what happened next and it's on the public record. In 1935, for the 100th anniversary of a related milestone in the festival's history, the fruit column was rebuilt and reinstated on the Waisen, in its traditional spot, where with some gaps for the chaos of the Second World War it has stood ever since. Today it's rebuilt nearly every year for the festival. A wooden column around 85 feet tall, weighing about 3.5 tons, decorated with the literal fruit and vegetables of that year's harvest, standing in the same field where the very first one went up in 1818. It's one of the most photographed landmarks of the entire festival. Tourists take pictures next to its base by the thousands every single year. That's the whole erasure. A monument tied to a fallen monarchy got politically retired for about a decade and a half during a turbulent stretch of German history, and then it came back, in public, with a parade, for an anniversary everyone was invited to. It's a genuinely fascinating footnote in 20th century European history, the way political symbolism attaches itself to something as innocent-looking as a tower of fruit, but it is not a secret. It's written up in the festival's own official history, which you can go read right now. That to me is always the tell with this kind of content, and it's worth nomming as a pattern rather than a one-off. Almost every viral hidden history photo follows the same 3-step move. Step 1. Find a real image of something genuinely old, genuinely large, or genuinely strange-looking. A building, a monument, a tool, a tower of fruit. Step 2. Strip out the actual caption, the actual date, the actual explanation, because the real explanation is usually a little slow to get to and doesn't come preloaded with a villain. Step 3. Replace it with a story that has a secret, a victim, and an unnamed enemy, because that's the shape a story needs in order to travel fast online. The photograph does the work of proving something real is going on. The invented caption does the work of making you angry and curious at the same time. Neither step requires anyone to lie about the picture itself. The tower is real. The festival is real. The photograph is real. Whatever's fake usually lives entirely in the handful of words stitched underneath it. The real history is almost never boring. It's got kings and volcanoes and famine and fallen monarchies and 100-year-old tradition still running today. It just doesn't need a hidden villain to be worth talking about. I want to sit with that for a second, because I think it says something about why images like this spread the way they do in the first place. When you see a photograph like the one in that thumbnail, genuinely strange looking, genuinely huge, genuinely old, your brain does a very natural thing. It goes looking for an explanation big enough to match the size of the thing you're looking at. A king's court architect built this to celebrate a harvest festival after a volcano caused a famine is, frankly, a lot to type out and a lot to hold in your head. This is the last surviving proof of a lost global civilization that fed the world for free until 13 families stole it, is one sentence, delivers an emotional gut punch, and gives you someone to be angry at. The real explanation asks more of you. It asks you to sit with the fact that ordinary people, a couple hundred years ago, dealing with a climate disaster they didn't understand the cause of, built something beautiful and strange out of pure stubborn hope, and that it's still standing because their descendants kept choosing, year after year, to rebuild it. That's not a smaller story. If anything, it's a bigger one. It's just a human-sized big, not a mythological big, and those hit differently. I think that's worth remembering the next time one of these photos crosses your feed with a big dramatic caption slapped across it. It's not that the picture is fake. Very often it isn't. The tower is real. The photo is real. What's usually fake, or at least invented out of nothing, is the caption underneath it, because a real caption requires someone to actually go looking, and a fake one only requires someone willing to type. Before I get to that, I want to actually address the 13 families claimed directly, because I think it deserves more than a dismissive eye roll. It deserves to be looked at the same way I looked at the fruit column, closely and honestly. The idea shows up across a whole category of online content right now, that a small, unnamed group of families, usually 13, sometimes a different number, secretly own or control something enormous. Sometimes it's the world's food supply. Sometimes it's the banking system. Sometimes it's a lost technology or a lost architectural style, or in this case, a lost network of food forests. And almost every version of the claim has the exact same shape. It's presented as something the narrator discovered through independent research. It always involves land records that supposedly don't trace back far enough. It always describes officials or archives that wouldn't answer, or restricted access, which is framed as suspicious, even though most historical archives restrict casual public access to fragile original documents as a matter of routine preservation, not concealment. And it always stops short of actually naming names, because the moment you name a real family or a real institution, the claim becomes falsifiable. Someone can go check it, find nothing, and the whole thing collapses. That's not a coincidence. That's a formula. And once you notice the formula, you start seeing it get reused on completely different subjects, with completely different photographs, decade after decade. The 13 families framing isn't a research conclusion. It's a template, and it gets stapled onto whatever mysterious-looking image happens to be going viral that month, whether the image is a fruit column in Stuttgart, a mountain nobody's climbed, or an old building nobody's bothered to look up. The photograph is usually real. The institution supposedly hiding its secret is usually invented from nothing. Here's the simplest way I can put it. A claim that a specific group of 13 families secretly runs global food production is either true or it isn't. If it's true, it should be provable: court records, corporate filings, land registries, genealogies, the boring paperwork trail that actually catches powerful people doing shady things in the real world all the time. Real conspiracies, the kind that hold up in court, get proven with exactly that kind of paperwork. What this claim offers instead is a photograph of a very real, very well-documented 19th century harvest festival, and a story stitched on top of it that can't be checked against anything, because there's nothing underneath it to check. I'm not telling you this to make you feel silly for finding the photo compelling. I found it compelling too. That's exactly why I went and looked into it. I'm telling you because the actual history turned out to be more interesting than the myth, not less. And I'd rather hand you something you can verify yourself than something you just have to take my word for. Now back to Stuttgart for a second, because there's more worth knowing about how this thing actually gets built, and it's honestly kind of remarkable on its own merits. The modern fruit column isn't preserved from 1818, it's rebuilt. Nearly every year, craftsmen construct a new column from scratch, a wooden frame roughly 85 feet tall, engineered to carry roughly 3.5 tons of produce without collapsing under its own weight. Apples, pears, grapes, squash, and grain are wired and stacked onto the frame in careful, dense layers, working from the base upward over a span of days, by teams who have often done this same job for years running. It gets topped with an ornamental crown-like structure, the same basic silhouette that's shown up in photographs going back over a century, including the ones in your thumbnail. For a while, in the 1990s, organizers even experimented with leaving it standing year-round, so it could be seen not just at the Autumn Volksfest but at the smaller Spring Festival too. Today, it's typically taken down after the festival ends and rebuilt again the following year. A living tradition, not a museum piece, maintained by choice, by people who could stop doing it any year they wanted to and simply haven't. There's something worth sitting with in that. A monument doesn't survive 200 years by accident, and it definitely doesn't survive by being hidden. It survives because generation after generation of ordinary people, festival organizers, craftsmen, town councils, tourists posting photos, decided it was worth the effort to put it back up one more time. That's the opposite of erasure. That's about as public and as consistently chosen as a tradition can get. And it's not the only structure like it in Europe, either, which is worth knowing if you want to go down this rabbit hole further on your own. Harvest columns, decorated arches, and food-covered monuments show up across European festival history in dozens of local forms, different names, different regions, different centuries, but the same underlying instinct. Mark a hard season's end by building something enormous out of the thing you were afraid you'd lose. Once you know what you're looking for, you start noticing versions of this custom everywhere, hiding in plain sight in old festival photographs from a dozen different countries, not because it was suppressed, but because nobody outside the local historical societies usually bothers to ask what it actually is. There's one more piece of this I want to leave you with, because it hits close to home for a lot of you watching this in the States. Both of these traditions, the German fruit column and the Italian cucagna, came to America in the pockets of the people who immigrated here. In Philadelphia, German immigrants founded the Cannstatter Volksfestverein back in 1873, explicitly to keep the tradition of that harvest festival alive on this side of the Atlantic. That club is still active today, still hosting an annual Cannstatter festival every Labor Day weekend, more than 150 years later. And a few miles away, in the same city, Italian-American families in the historic Italian market still put up a greased cucagna pole every spring and climb it for cheese and cash, exactly the way it was done in Naples centuries ago. So if you're in Philly and you've never noticed either of these traditions happening literally in your own city, now you know where to look. The Cannstatter Club there has spent over a century and a half doing more than just throwing a party, too. Alongside the festival itself, they've historically put festival proceeds toward German-language schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and support for families in need. The same instinct that built the very first fruit column in 1818 turn a celebration of a good harvest into something that actually helps people get through a hard year. That thread runs all the way from a Wurtemberg field in 1818 to a Philadelphia clubhouse today, and almost nobody driving past that clubhouse on Labor Day weekend has any idea the tradition traces back to a volcano on the other side of the world. And it's not just Philadelphia. If you widen the lens, you start to realize just how much of American harvest culture is built on exactly this kind of imported, adapted festival tradition. Stuttgart's own Cannstatter Volksfest is actually the direct ancestor of Oktoberfest-style celebrations that exist in cities across the U.S. Cincinnati, Milwaukee, La Crosse, dozens of smaller towns with strong German immigrant roots, all of them descended from the same basic template of a harvest festival meant to lift a community's spirits after hard times. County fairs and state fairs across the Midwest and South carry a version of that same DNA, even without a single fruit column in sight. Livestock competitions, produce contests, parades, all tracing back to that same 19th century European instinct to publicly celebrate the harvest as proof that scarcity is temporary. You don't need 13 secret families and a hidden food forest to explain any of it. You need immigration, memory, and a community willing to keep setting up the same tent every year. It's worth pausing on that land of Cacaney myth one more time, too, because I think it's the emotional core of this whole story, and it's a much better story than the conspiracy version. Cacaney wasn't a real place anyone claimed to have found. Everyone who told the story knew it was make-believe. It was a peasant fantasy, passed down for centuries in poems and woodcuts, about a world where nobody had to work themselves to exhaustion just to eat. Rivers of wine, roofs made of pastry, roast geese that walked right up and offered themselves to be eaten. It's a wish, not a memory. And what's genuinely moving, once you know that, is watching people across 400 years of European history keep trying to build a physical, temporary version of that wish out of real fruit and real bread and real cheese. A Naples arch in 1629, a Stuttgart column in 1818, a greased pole in a Philadelphia street market this coming May, as if building it, even for a weekend, even knowing it would be torn down or eaten or dismantled, was worth doing anyway. That's not a lost civilization being hidden from you. That's the same hope, rebuilt by hand, generation after generation, in public on purpose. That's the real story behind the mysterious fruit columns. Not erased, not stolen, not hidden behind 13 family names nobody can produce. Built by a king trying to give a starving kingdom a reason to hope, rooted in a much older tradition of turning food into celebration, taken down once for very explainable political reasons, put right back up for an anniversary everybody could watch, and still standing, right now, in the same field by the same river, over 200 years later. If you enjoyed pulling on that thread with me, there's a lot more of this kind of thing where real history turns out to be stranger and better than the myth built on top of it. Subscribing means you don't miss the next one when it drops. And before you go, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from. City, state, doesn't matter. I just like knowing where this channel is actually reaching. See you in the next one.